Thank you very much for the introduction and hello to everyone. At the outset, I want to thank the organizers of the Humanitas Unisinos Institute for initiating this program and for inviting me to be part of it. It is a very meaningful exercise to look into issues affecting our lives from different parts of the globe and to realize that we have similar concerns about them. In our shared attempt to address the many unresolved questions, we may find light that could guide us on the path ahead. Today is the feast of Mary Magdalene, and it is liberatively significant that we are reconsidering the gender question on her feast. She was someone who broke the gendered molds of her times by being intensely daring and passionate about her discipleship of Jesus Christ. Her imagery as a fiercely strong and free woman surely invites us to become more daring in our commitment to liberate ourselves and others in the process. So I'm very happy we have chosen this day, the Feast of Mary Magdalene, to deliberate on the question of gender. And I wish to draw liberative energies from Magdalene as we discuss this issue and its implications for our lives today. The topic asked of me was titled Reconsiderations of the Masculine and the Feminine in Contemporary Theology, Tasks and Perspectives. Exercising the freedom to change the title, I have reworded it as, quote unquote, Gender Trouble in Catholic Theology, Revisiting Gender from a Liberative Perspective. I borrow the expression gender trouble from Judith Butler's classic work, Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity, published in 1990, a book that was widely acclaimed for the questions it raised on the relationship between sex, gender, and sexuality. Obviously, the term trouble signifies that there is a problem. So we need to ask why gender is a problematic within the Christian framework. Where do the roots of this problem lie? How do we develop notions of gender that are theologically liberative? These are some of the basic questions that will be addressed in this presentation. Dealing with these questions will obviously involve reconsiderations of the masculine and the feminine in contemporary theology and examining the tasks and perspectives underlying the same. In this presentation, I take the gendered theology of the Catholic Church as a point of reference or as a case of analysis, and in the course of the presentation, it will become clear why I prefer to use the term gender instead of masculine and feminine. I shall begin with an anecdote that signals to the gender problematic within the Catholic framework. This anecdote relates to Pope Francis, one of the most loved popes in the recent Catholic history, who has taken some remarkable steps appointing women to some top leadership positions in the Vatican. Yet, on the question of gender, Apparently, Pope Francis was very confused. Addressing the participants of an international symposium held at the Vatican on the topic Man, Woman, Image of God for an Anthropology of Vocations in March 2024, Pope Francis described gender ideology as the ugliest danger of our time. In his opinion, the gifts of men and women are fruitful together, and to erase the difference between men and women, it is to erase humanity. For this reason, Pope Francis found eliminating differences with gender ideology a terrible danger. If gender ideology is perceived as a danger to humanity, we need to examine if that allegation is true and why it is perceived as a threat to Christian anthropology. So we shall now examine the gender question. A historical reading of the meanings attributed to human identity regarding man and woman could help us comprehend why the notion of gender is perceived as troublesome. For a very long time in the story of human evolution, women remained invisible, inaudible, and confined to the domestic space. They were expected to be feminine by exercising qualities that would focus primarily on nurturing and caring roles in a self-sacrificing mode, totally available to be at the service of the family or of the community to which they belonged. Men, on the other hand, were expected to be masculine in exercising roles of leadership in the family and in the public space. Since the male was taken to be normative of the human species, they occupied positions of power and authority, and women were generally accustomed to, or they were conditioned to be, quote unquote, comfortable in the spaces allotted for them on the lowest rungs of the gender hierarchy. The association of the so-called masculine qualities with male bodies and the feminine qualities with femaleness resulted in gender stereotyping of men and women. The masculinity traits expected of men socialize them to be rational, indomitable, independent, self-sufficient, active, and self-assured, whereas the femininity expected of women led to their socialization in qualities such as intuition, passivity, tenderness, sensitivity, docility, receptivity, empathy, dependence, and above all, being emotional. Obviously, the masculine qualities were taken to be superior and holding power in relation to the feminine traits. While this classification of males and females into clear-cut masculine and feminine categories continued unquestioned for ages, it is with the emergence of the feminist movement that this was challenged, based on the conviction that these are all human qualities, which are not inborn but socially constructed. Feminist theorizing spelled out the sex-gender distinction, arguing that a person is born a male or a female as per the chromosomal differences, but the manner in which one evolves as a man or woman depends on other parameters that are historically conditioned and on the socio-cultural, religious, and other factors that influence the growth of that person. The identification of masculine traits with male bodies and the feminine with femaleness was challenged and deconstructed on the grounds that these are all human qualities which can be developed by women, men, or LGBTQI plus persons, depending on the situations in which they are groomed. Consequently, this gender ideology or the understanding that the way of evolving as a man or woman is situational and cannot be identified with biology came to be seen as a threat to the established order of human relationships. It threatened the positioning of man and woman in the domestic as well as in the public space. This has led to the eruption of the gender trouble, or as expressed by Pope Francis, the ugliest danger that erases human differences. As Kathleen Cavani observes, this is because Vatican worries that some strands of secular feminism are emphasizing equality to the detriment of difference. It worries that this obscures the ontological difference between men and women and the goodness of that difference for both individuals and society. In particular, it fears that an insufficient appreciation of difference will denigrate women's unique power as mothers who shape and nurture the next generation. Gender ideology does not erase difference between men and women, but challenges the hierarchical positioning of the sexes and the discrimination encountered by women on account of their physical difference from men. Since language is the first indicator of gender becoming a real issue over the years, the mainstreaming of words such as gender discrimination, gender stereotypes, gender justice, gender equality, reproductive rights, gender fluidity, sexual minorities, and the like are not indicating an expanding vocabulary, but they are capturing a transformation of popular perception. We shall examine first the meanings attributed to the term gender and then look into its theological underpinnings. Gender, as scholars observe, has multiple meanings as ideology, as social process, and as a social product. It is used as an analytical term. It can be used in an inclusive sense, and it is also expressed in a descriptive sense. As an analytical term, gender expresses socio-cultural definitions of man and woman. Obviously, that brings out the differences. The way societies distinguish men and women and assign them social roles. The social construction of gender gets inscribed on women and men through individual socialization and public discourses. Family, education, religion, media, language, and other vehicles of culture all play a significant role in this. This is all the more evident in cultures marked by patriarchy, where masculinity and femininity are repeatedly reinforced, mainly through the hegemonic codes of religion. And this has led to the creation of a gendered consciousness in women and men. This becomes problematic when the constructed differences are internalized by both the sexes, and this gets normalized as a way of being women and men. Anne Oakley calls the internalization of differences as gendering. Gendering is a process. Through gendering, men and women assume roles and restricted behavior patterns on the basis of their sex. In a culture informed by patriarchy, which privileges men's choices, desires, and interests over and above those of women, gendering has stunted the growth process of both women and men. In the secular sphere over the last few decades, gender concerns have been systematically addressed both in the academia and in the grassroots, thanks to the engaging presence of the feminist movement in the different fields of social life. Against this backdrop, we can rightly say that it is high time that the gender question is addressed theologically. Now we shall look at the masculine and the feminine in contemporary Catholic theology. In 2019, the Vatican issued a document titled Male and Female He Created Them Towards a Path of Dialogue on the question of gender theory in education. This document rereads the Genesis narrative of creation of humans based on the assertion that Holy Scripture reveals the wisdom of the Creator's assigning the human body in masculinity and femininity. This document problematizes gender theory on the contention that, I quote, it denies the difference and reciprocity in nature of a man and a woman and envisages society without sexual differences, thereby eliminating and the anthropological basis of the family. End of the quote. It argues that gender ideology is a serious disorientation regarding anthropology, which could lead to destabilize the family as an institution. Certainly, Pope Francis's views on gender ideology are based on the perspectives of this document, on the basis of the argument that gender theory cancels out the difference between men and women, presenting them instead as merely the product of historical and cultural conditioning. On 22nd November 2022, 5 representatives of the magazine America interviewed Pope Francis on many issues, and he was specifically asked his opinion about the possibility of women's ordination to priesthood. The Pope responded saying that this is a theological problem. In Francis's words, I quote, I think we amputate the being of the church if we consider only the way of the ministerial dimension of the life of the church. The way is not only ordained ministry. The church is woman. The church is a spouse. We have not developed a theology of women that reflects this. The ministerial dimension, we can say, is that of the Petrine Church. The Petrine principle is that of ministry. But there is another principle that is still more important, about which we do not speak. That is the Marian principle, which is the principle of femininity. in the church, of the woman in the church, where the church sees a mirror of herself because the church is a woman and a spouse. A church with only the Petrine principle would be a church that one would think is reduced to its ministerial dimension, nothing else. But the church is more than a ministry. It is the whole people of God. Therefore, the dignity of women is mirrored in this way. End of quote. You will get the full interview in the America magazine of 18/11/2022. In contemporary theology, as expressed in Pope Francis's words, the Petrine principle is the principle of masculinity and the related ministerial and leadership roles that men would exercise in the church. Complementing this is the Marian principle, the principle of femininity in the church, which, according to this theological viewpoint, reflects the way of being church, the spouse of Christ. Unfortunately, the teaching authority of the church does not explain what would be the specific role of women as spouse of Christ. This way of understanding masculinity and femininity following the Petrine and the Marian principles depicts a gendered theology that curtails the full growth and contribution of both men and women as Christian faithful. Perhaps the Catholic magisterium does not see any problem in this clear-cut distinction between masculinity and femininity and the accompanying roles for women and men in the church. However, for the secular world and for the Christian faithful who have evolved, particularly in the course of the last century, in seeing human persons as different but equal in dignity, there is a deep-rooted gender problem in the assertions made by Pope Francis. Underlying the complementarity of roles of women and men is the question of power, and that is theologically masked as the Petrine and Marian principle. Earlier, in 1988, Pope John Paul had issued an apostolic letter titled Mulieris Dignitate, in which he honored and celebrated, quote unquote, feminine genius of women in all walks of life, public as well as private, in the world of work as well as in the domestic space. Women with feminist sensibilities who see themselves as fully human persons felt very uncomfortable with this tag of feminine genius, as they prefer to be addressed as women who stand on an equal footing with men in all walks of life. Biology is not my destiny, a much repeated slogan of the women's liberation movement worldwide, finds a strong echo here in women's resistance to be the feminine genius. Theologians with feminist sensibilities, women as well as men, argue that the theological legitimization of the complementarity of the sexes leads to the gendering of theological anthropology, the reinforcement of gender stereotypes, and this will sustain religious patriarchy. When sexual differences are construed in this manner, biological determinism turns out to be a theological category, and gender becomes an ideology which serves to mask and legitimize inequality. The complementarity of the sexes is all the more tricky in the Catholic Church, as jurisdiction is intrinsically linked to the clerical ordination. Women are expected to remain in the spaces and roles allotted to them as dictated by men in religious authority who are clerics. In the bargain, the life of the church becomes impoverished as women's voices and wisdom do not find adequate expression in the church's policy-making processes and pastoral praxis. It is interesting to note that terms like gender justice or gender equality are not in the vocabulary of church documents. When the feminine ethos is reinforced through a gendered theology of womanhood, when this gets internalized, women uncritically accept their subordinate role in the existing order of things. It may be because they see or imagine no alternative to it, or they see it as natural and unchangeable, or because they even value it as divinely ordained and beneficial. Stephen Lucas, a social theorist, calls this the most insidious form of power, that which shapes people's cognitions in such a way that they accept uncritically their role in an oppressive system. Identifying masculine qualities with maleness also poses a problem. It could lead to the normalization of dominating traits in men, particularly when they are substantiated by scriptural texts such as man is the head or he shall rule over you and similar texts. The hegemonic codes of religion thus serve to legitimize gender hierarchy, and this becomes the basis of the system of patriarchy. Women may be present in parish councils in keeping with the post-Vatican II developments, but the decision-taking roles are mainly confined to those holding clerical authority in the church, and these are men. It has been a groundbreaking step that Pope Francis appointed a few women to top leadership roles in the Vatican, like Sister Natalie Beckart as the Under-Secretary of the Synod of Bishops, Sister Simona Brambilla as the Prefect of the Dicastery of Consecrated Life, and Sister Raffini Petrini as President of the Vatican City State of Administration, a position that was always held by top male officials in the Vatican. These are few examples, and definitely Pope Francis has appointed a few more. While these appointments are hailed across the globe, these can be seen as moves made by a benevolent leader, which do not lead to any structural change or in the theological understanding of what it means to be church in today's world. Now we shall come to the last part, where we shall look at a liberative Christian anthropology. How do we move towards that? Across the globe, there is a growing restlessness about the theological position taken by the Catholic Church on the question of gender. A noted feminist British theologian, Tina Beattie, observes that Many women are leaving the church not because they have lost their faith, but because of the conflict between the institutional church and modern society around issues of gender and women's rights, including sexual and reproductive rights. This is exacerbated by the sense of betrayal that many feel over the sex abuse crisis. BT argues that if the Catholic Church is to be relevant to modern women, it needs to go beyond its traditional anachronistic sexual stereotypes and hierarchies and present the gospel in a way that is attentive to the questions, needs, and values of the age without surrendering the central truths of Christian faith. Only by freeing the theological vision of the church from the sexual stranglehold will it be possible to listen to the questions women are asking today. Questions regarding the role of women in the church and the sacramental significance of the female body in the liturgical performance of the story of salvation. For that matter, I find this reflects also the questions raised by LGBTQI plus persons in today's world. And if the church is to evolve as a community that includes everyone, that holds everyone together, in spite of their sexual orientation, it has to grow beyond gender binary fixations. I'm afraid it is not just women, but the whole church that becomes impoverished if women are perceived as reflecting only the Marian principle. If this means theologically as a way of being church the spouse. In cultures informed by patriarchy, particularly in culture like that of India, the spouse who is the wife is a shadowy figure, dependent on the husband's benevolence in her way of being and becoming. Unfortunately, the Marian principle mirrors this experience in the church. Without ordination, Catholic women do not have the possibilities of active engagement in the sacramental mediation of the divine and in leadership roles, which makes possible their partnership with men in the administrative and pastoral responsibilities of the church. Catholic theology is not sustainable without affirming women's identity in a manner that is egalitarian. And so, the task to deconstruct a gender theology and make it liberative becomes an ecclesiastical necessity with a sense of urgency. The exhortation to emulate the feminine in Mary with dispositions of listening, welcoming, humility, faithfulness, praise, and waiting, as expressed in the 2004 document from the Vatican, which is titled Letter to the Bishops of the Catholic Church on the Collaboration of Women and Men in the Church and in the World, explains the problematic of the Marian principle. These human dispositions, which are applicable to male, female, or trans persons, but when pronounced as characteristic features of womanliness, positions women in a gendered mold and denies them opportunities to exercise their full human potential as full-fledged ecclesiastical citizens. However, though the patriarchal grip of religions continue to be strong, some tremors are being felt, thanks to the emergence of feminist theologizing that is beginning to have an impact. Feminist theology critiques the religious legitimization of women's subjugation and exploitation, and redefines religious or theological meaning-making systems and knowledge in ways that are liberative for women and for all forms of life in this universe. Women are asking critical questions about themselves, the world, God, and life at large. And this is posing a serious challenge to the gendered socio-cultural systems of thought and practice. Personal and collective engagement of women in this questioning process is already triggering what I would call a gender quake that is shaking the established foundations of religious patriarchy while creating enabling spaces for women. Noted feminist theologian Rosemary Radford Ruether has stated with critical sharpness that whatever denies, diminishes, or distorts the full humanity of women must be presumed not to reflect the divine or an authentic relation to the divine or to reflect the authentic nature of things or to be a message or work of an authentic redeemer or a community of redemption. In other words, orthopraxis, in terms of the role played by women in the church, is the litmus test of orthodoxy regarding Christian anthropology. Until women are recognized as full and equal participants in the life of faith, until women are acknowledged as persons graced with the image of God, capable of representing Christ to the world as fully and effectively as men do, the church herself will continue to be a spiritual desert where men's fears and fantasies lead them to refuse the grace that female sacramentality might bring to Catholic, liturgical, and institutional life. I think rather than depend on the all-male magisterium of the church to define what would be a liberative theology of womanhood, it is time that women wake up and weave new patterns into their theological imagination. Feminist theology takes women's experience as the criterion of truth, and it engages in a critical, contextual, constructive, and creative rereading and rewriting of Christian theology, observes Nathalie Watson. It regards women, their bodies, perspectives, and experiences as relevant to the agenda of Christian theologians and advocates them as subjects of the theological discourses and as full citizens of the church. In this task, I find the biblical imagery of the woman searching for the lost coin an appropriate hermeneutical tool to articulate the theology of womanhood today. The common understanding of this coin is of money that has fallen out of a woman's pocket or purse. But today, scholars are discovering the different meanings and symbolic values attributed to this coin. In archaeological museums, women of the first century Palestine are depicted wearing necklaces or headdresses of beautiful coins which was a statement of their public identity. For many people and cultures throughout history, the way one's body is dressed and adorned display many aspects of self-identity, such as social status, gender, age, and the like. For the woman of the gospel story, the loss of the coin was tragic and unacceptable because it meant losing something of her identity, and so she searches for it with great intensity. Rereading this parable from a feminist theological angle, we can also see that in the woman's search to find what was lost, the broom, a symbol of her place under the roof of patriarchy and hence of oppression, is transformed to the instrument of liberation. On finding the coin, she rediscovers her identity. Now she knows who she is and her place in society. Traditionally, theology was used to keep women in her place, and it had become a symbol of oppression. Now, in women's search for their true self, their identity, theology becomes the broom. Theology is transformed into an instrument of liberation. In their emergence from eclipse to agency, which means they're moving from margin to center, from invisibility to presence, from silence to the praise of God, says Elizabeth Chisler Fiorenza. This implies affirming the full humanity of women beyond the gendered feminine prescriptions, affirming women as thinking, speaking, and acting persons who can assert their subjectivity and make the rightful contributions befitting their baptismal call and vocation in the church and as church. This also implies rethinking masculinities, which is a task that needs to be addressed in the church with a sense of urgency, as this is crucial for the church to emerge as a community of equal discipleship in the world today. It is also crucial to address the issue of toxic masculinity and the consequent clergy sexual abuse, which had become like an epidemic in the church of today. Breaking gendered molds cannot be done in a top-down approach. This has to start from below. And this will happen when women who are positioned on the lower rungs of the gender hierarchy wake up to a new consciousness of who they are. This happens when Catholic women, and all women, begin to assert their agency, particularly their intellectual, spiritual, and theological agency. Agency is a very rich word because it implies realizing one's capacity to make a difference, or as noted by the Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, agency is the antidote to victimization. When Catholic women break free of the victimizing molds of gender stereotyped identity and assert their baptismal rights and responsibilities, they exercise agency in the church. When this happens, we will see the repetition of another gospel miracle, the straightening of the bent woman, as narrated in Luke chapter 13, verses 10 to 17. Here, as I see, the bent woman is not symbolizing just the female Christian faithful of the Catholic Church, but the church as woman, borrowing Pope Francis's expression. If the church is woman, she is bent or crippled by a gendered theology that has stunted her growth of the church as a whole. Neither women nor men or those belonging to LGBTQI plus persons who are part of the Catholic fold will grow into the fullness of their human potential if they subscribe to a gendered Christian anthropology, and the church will continue to remain bent. Hence, straightening the bent woman or the bent church is the need of the hour. And women who are awakened to a liberated consciousness and exercise their agency will embody Jesus, who will work this miracle. So we don't need a clerical representation of Jesus here. It is time that this miracle is reenacted in the universal church. And so a critical question that we need to ask is, if not now, when? Now I come to the conclusion. I started on the premise that the notion of gender is a problematic issue in the Catholic Church. And it is not easily resolvable. It is not an easily resolvable issue, as gender questions are intrinsically linked to the theological understanding of being church, founded on an all-male clerical leadership. All the same, even as Pope Francis has been wary of gender ideology, he has spoken emphatically on the need to demasculinize the church. Pope Francis acknowledged to the members of the International Theological Commission on 30th November 2023 that one of the great sins of the church is masculinizing the church. His contention was that women have a capacity for theological reflection that is different from what we men have. Though the statement may have gendered overtones, the different steps Pope Francis has taken to include many women in the Vatican administration is a clear indication of his attempts to demasculinize the church. The task of demasculinize the church cannot be realized just with some appointments of women in the Vatican. We as individuals, institutions, need to take up this task. This mission to transform the church from its present patriarchal model as a community of to a community of Christian faithful in all its diversity, reflecting or trying to be a witness to the inclusive gospel vision of the kingdom indicated by Jesus Christ in the world. It is an equally significant move that the church of the 21st century wants to evolve on the synodal path. The vision of synodality can be a groundbreaking step as the church envisions itself as a body where all the faithful walk together on the path of realizing its vision and mission in today's world. While the vision of synodality is very appealing and can become a turning point in the history of the church, as the Second Vatican Council has been, it is not clear what is really implied in the praxis of synodality. In today's world, women are not remaining victims of patriarchy, though the cultural subjugation of females persists in different shades across the globe. Women are emerging as central actors in every sphere of life, engaging dynamically in the political front, in the economic and developmental questions affecting the life of fellow humans and that of the planet, of ecology, of climate crisis, and the like. It is at this crucial juncture in the evolutionary story of humans that straightening the bent woman church becomes decisive. The gospel narrative of the bent woman says that the woman had been bent for long 18 years. Today's scripture scholars say that 18, the number 18 is symbolic, as it is a number of bondage in the Bible. In a similar vein, we can say that for too long, both women and men have been in bondage to gender norms and gender stereotype roles in the church. For too long, gender non-conforming persons who refuse to be tagged and under the heterosexual gender binary, who claim their space and existence in gender fluidity, have been denied their rights as human persons and full-fledged members of ecclesiastical communities. It is time that all are straightened up so that the church becomes a liberated community that can witness powerfully to the kingship vision and mission initiated by Jesus Christ in this world. Spirit Sophia, who is the spirit Jesus promised to his disciples, has already begun this work of straightening the bent woman church. And we can be her collaborators in this mission when we commit ourselves to the task of liberating theology and liberating the church from its gendered bondages. Thank you very much.